My name, to those of you who do not know me, I am Isadora Hellegren, the Go to 10 project lead at the Swedish Internet Foundation, and I have the great honor today to be presenting this event's speaker. Tonight, you see, we're going to talk about the power of social change. When the metoo movement hit the world 2 years ago, numerous other hashtags followed to support the call to end sexual harassment. Teknisktfel, or technical error, is the Swedish metoo movement for the tech industry. And it has revealed the magnitude of the workplace environment issues that so many women face. And our speaker tonight, she is one of the coordinators of the teknisktfel movement in Sweden, and together with all of us, she will look at the metoo movements and what it actually tells us about gender equality. Together, we will look at why organizations need to get more innovative when it comes to diversity and inclusion, and actually ask, how do we move forward to build more inclusion in the workplace and in society at large? Our speaker tonight actually left a successful career at one of the world's largest IT companies to pursue her dream to influence organizations to become more diverse and inclusive. She now runs her own company and supports her customers to create more inclusive environments and inclusive recruitment and workplace practices. And a fun fact is that she started out here at Go to 10 at our co-working space on second floor. So we are very proud of that. And she has also held board positions in Red Cross Södermalm, been president of the Professional Women's Network in Stockholm, and has led Cisco's internal women's network in Sweden. So please welcome Sara Jonasson Ginters.
Thank you. What a wonderful introduction, and how lovely it is to be here tonight to talk about some of my favorite topics. And in the spirit of inclusion, I'm giving this talk in English. So about 20 years ago already, I joined the IT industry, and I really didn't know anything about it, or at least not much. I think I've just started emailing a few years before that. But I quickly learned that IT is heavily male-dominated. At the same time, it's an incredibly exciting industry, and I had a fantastic career there as well. I kept asking the question, why? How come more women don't actually go into IT and tech? What's holding them back, or rather, what's stopping them? I left Cisco 2 years ago, handed in my resignation, didn't quite know what to do, but decided to start my own company to really focus on the topics of gender equality in IT and tech, and also inclusion at large. I'm also one of the coordinators behind teknisktfel, and so I have this great passion about addressing the problem that sexual harassment is in the workplace today, as it is one indicator of the fact that IT still isn't inclusive of women. But the story of metoo starts quite a long time before that. The story of metoo starts back in 2006 with this woman. This is Tarana Burke. She's an American activist and social worker, and she started an organization called Just Be Inc., an organization aimed at supporting young black women who were the victims of sexual harassment and violence. And as Tarana Burke started listening to these young women's stories, it triggered memories within her of her own quite painful past of sexual violence and assault. She wasn't able to share her story, so she started or coined the term Me Too. And Me Too became a way for Tarana Burke and her staff to show these young women that they empathized with them, that they supported them, and acknowledged their bravery in sharing their stories. Fast forward to 2017, and the New York Times published an article outing the huge movie producer Harvey Weinstein. And a large group of actresses, Hollywood actresses, stepped forward and shared their stories of how Weinstein had molested them for years. About a week later, there was a tweet, and the tweet read, If you've been sexually harassed or assaulted, write "Me Too" as a reply to this tweet. And further suggested by a friend, if all the women who have been sexually harassed or assaulted wrote "Me Too" as a status, we might give people a sense of the magnitude of the problem. This was Alyssa Milano and another actress who tweeted, and within 24 hours there had been more than 500,000 tweets and retweets and more than 12 million likes, comments and shares on Facebook, all with the hashtag #MeToo. In Sweden, #MeToo has had a really massive impact. There have been more than 50 subsequent hashtags with more than 100,000 signatures supporting these hashtags. They cover a wide variety of groups in society as well as industries and professionals. Everything from archaeologists, doctors, teachers, dancers, opera singers, actors, lawyers, and of course also really marginalized groups like women who don't normally have a voice, women caught in prostitution, or women who are victims of sexual violence in the context of honorary violence. And of course, the tech industry has its own hashtag. On November 19, we released the hashtag teknisktfel. And we received about 2,000 signatures supporting our hashtag. And we received more than 400 stories from women sharing their experiences of sexual harassment in the workplace. The stories come from tech to IT to the automotive industry to construction. So really a wide variety of groups within the general tech sector. There are 7 of us coordinating this hashtag. And in the last year or so, we've been publishing different articles. We've been putting forward demands on what we think needs to happen and what employers need to do to change things around. And the power of these hashtags, including the one for teknisktfel, is of course the stories that we hear. They really tells us black and white that we do not have an inclusive work environment. And I'd like to share a few of those stories with you. In the first week at my new workplace, where I was hired as a project manager, I was referred to as our new decoration by one of the senior male project members. One morning at work in the industry, I was attacked, beaten, and exposed to a rape attempt. The 2 perpetrators explained that women didn't belong there. My employer's healthcare team suggested I dress less provocatively. At the time of the attack, I was wearing protective industry clothing. And my manager sent me inappropriate text messages for several years. He made comments about my body, how he felt when he was near me, and what he would like to do to me. These are just a few examples, and maybe not even some of the worst examples that we received. So why did #MeToo, or why is #MeToo such a huge movement? The answer is quite simple. It's because sexual harassment is such a widespread problem today. In a survey done in 2014, so pre-MeToo, across the European Union, 28 countries, the following numbers were reported by women in response to the question whether they have been sexually harassed at any point. And if we then pick on Sweden, we can see that 81% of women responded they have been sexually harassed at least once since the age of 15. So does that mean that in Sweden this beacon of gender equality as we know it has a higher level of sexual harassment compared to other European countries? Probably not. But we know that there are varying views of what sexual harassment actually is. We know that the stigma around sexual harassment also varies between countries and cultures. And we also know that in Sweden we have some of the strictest sexual legislation in the world, which means that the knowledge and awareness and perception of what we see as sexual harassment may differ from other countries. So this is in society at large. What about the workplace? In this survey from 2017, 30% of women between 16 and 29 reported they have been sexually harassed in the last year in the workplace. We can see that the share of women being victims of sexual harassment goes down with age, but still the numbers are significant. Of course, another thing we can see in this chart is that also men are victims of sexual harassment, but not at all to the same extent. So has Me Too led to a change? What do you say? Hand up if you believe it has. And we'll see some virtual hands hopefully online. Yes. So of course Me Too has changed things around. Not only have we seen people in power, men in power, having to step down all across politics and entertainment and all sorts of industries. We still see the ripple effects today. In India, politicians are having to step down. In the US, of course, we see examples of it too. In the Catholic Church, we see sexual violence and priests being confronted. And of the Swedish population, 65% also said in a survey last year that things have changed. And the changes consist of, again, the awareness and knowledge of what sexual harassment actually is has gone up. We react, we speak up when we see it happening to others. And most importantly, some of the stigma is going away. And the shame and the blame that has very much sat with the victims before is transferred now to the perpetrators, of course, where it should be. So things have changed. And on that positive note, I would like to show a short movie. So of course things have changed, and this video is funny, right? Because it tells us that what we normally, or what we see normally in situations of sexual harassment is that we put the shame with the victim. When you turn it around and put it in this context, it makes no sense and it's funny, right? But we need to keep on working on this. So why talk about such length about Me Too when we talk about the gender gap in IT and tech? Well, because sexual harassment, of course, is an indicator and a symptom of non-inclusive workplaces. The IT and tech industries are highly male-dominated and very homogeneous in some places, extremely homogeneous. That in itself is a risk where sexual harassment will come often as a result. But is it really a problem? the tech industry are doing very well. We're delivering highly innovative solutions. We're solving complex societal problems and challenges. Oftentimes very successful companies from a numbers perspective. So is it a problem? It's all about perspectives. On the one hand, you could say it's really not a problem because we're doing pretty good without gender equality and a more healthier gender balance. If it ain't broke, why fix it, right? On the other hand, the tech industry faces an enormous challenge for the future. In regard to competence maintenance, in the EU 28 countries, there will be a gap of 900,000 employees with IT and tech competencies by 2020. The estimated productivity loss from women leaving the digital industries is estimated at 16.2 billion euros. In Sweden, by 2022, we're going to have a gap of 70,000 people with IT and digital competencies. So this is not a fluffy space. This is not something we should put in the corner of HR managers only. This is really a case for changing the businesses and how we drive inclusion. But it's also about what problem are we trying to solve, or what is actually the challenge. So in addition to the numbers speaking clearly to us, women experience also informal networks and not getting into networks in the workplace where decisions are made, maybe on the golf course, maybe in the bar late at night at a conference. Non-transparent decisions as to who gets recruited or promoted. No possibilities or difficult to combine a healthy personal life with a private life, which by the way impacts both men and women. Not to mention the fact that we still see a salary gap in the tech industry. Across the European countries, the gap is 19% between women and men. In Sweden, if we look at engineering roles, it's still 5% gap between women and men's salaries. So there are several reasons to stay out of tech. On the other hand, companies are driving activities and initiatives to address this. Many companies are doing a lot of sometimes really good things, sometimes not very productive things. But there is a general effort around this topic. We can read about it almost every day. Is it working? Not so much. This shows the share of women in IT and telecom in Sweden. And we can see in 2018, we have about 28% women in IT and telecom. I was quite hopeful last year when I saw the numbers for 2017, as we had since 2006 seen a decreasing trend, but it was slightly broken 2017 and had gone up. Unfortunately, I looked at the numbers the other day and it has again gone down. Despite tech delivering huge levels of innovation in many other areas, it seems that when it comes to the gender gap, they're just not hitting the mark. So what should companies do? And why do I like to think of innovation in this perspective? Why do we see a lot of efforts being done, but they're just not delivering any sustainable results? Well, I like to look at activities and focus areas based on a scale from more foundational towards more innovative things. And when you see some of the things on the foundational side, they're more hygiene factors. They're sort of must-haves. They're things that are good, but just won't change the status quo. When you move towards the more innovative focus areas and efforts, that's where we can really start to change things and drive transformation within this space. And I want to give you a few examples. I'd place legal requirements, of course, as a hygiene factor. All companies need to have routines and policies to address sexual harassment. It's a no-brainer. Diversity plans are well abound out there, but the problem with the diversity plan is that it's nothing without execution. Women's networks, I love them. I've been heavily engaged in women's networks and I love them. But they simply will not change the status quo. They provide great communities for the members, and they could have a greater potential to change things if our leaders took in the feedback from our different employee resource groups and really worked with that to create more inclusive workplaces. If we move further down the chain or the scale, we can talk about courses and educational efforts, salary reviews. There are also good efforts to take action on, but we know how it goes with courses and education. You can get great aha moments from it, or inspiration or knowledge, but when you go back to your workplace again and you sit at your desk, you'll probably fall back into your old habits. Further down the line, we can think of inclusive recruitment practices. How do we make sure that we don't keep hiring ourselves? That we don't keep hiring the people that are like us because it's easy and because we like to work with people who are like us? How do we communicate, and what images do we use on our websites and in our communications? Who do we send to conferences to speak? Who show up at panels? Who do we have on our, what do we write and what do we say in our communication, in outgoing communication, but also on websites? What language do we use? And engaging early. Many companies go out to to schools, young ages, both boys and girls, trying to show them the opportunities in tech. Let's do more of that, and let's go even earlier. We know that girls and boys are about equally interested in tech until the age of 12, and then they diverge. How do we capture that? And how do we capture them to continue their interests? Further down the line comes really heavy stuff. But that is where I believe the magic sits and where we'll be able to drive real change. Inclusive leadership. I'll be talking about that in a little bit, but how can we have more leaders who are willing to listen, who are willing to see that we all have our own conscious bias, also them? How can we make sure that we have more empathy in leadership? How can we make sure that leaders see the individuals and what they can bring and show the keenness to make an individual grow rather than trying to get individuals to fit in the current structures? What values do we live by? Not just what values are on our company page or company badges, but what values are actually alive here with us today, and how do they influence the behavior that we show towards another? What do we say? What is our jargon here? What is okay? How are leaders using or abusing their power? These are not new, innovative things. This is not someone sitting in a dark room coming up with that unique idea that will change everything. What's innovative with this is that we haven't done it enough in tech. These are new approaches that we need to take much more. And I see that these things are being worked at more so in possibly other industries and sectors, but we have a long way to go in tech. So, what would you say, for those of you who have worked in tech or do work in tech or know tech companies, if you have a think about these things, can you see at all, am I right, that this is sort of the approach that we should be thinking about when it comes to focus areas and tech? Just take a few seconds and think about it. So I'd love to hear if anyone is willing to speak up and share any examples that you may have. And we have a microphone, and we need the microphone for the video. Don't be afraid of the microphone.
Hi. I think, just like you right there, I think the inclusive leadership is something that we're struggling with, at least. I know that, I mean, I would say that we have and maybe in large in Sweden, we might have an inclusive leadership as maybe a goal, but I think we're still at a tolerant leadership. We're tolerating differences, we're tolerating not just differences, but different opinions too, but we're not really there in the inclusiveness. And that's something that we need to take this next step for.
Yeah, agreed. What else?
Hi. Well, I will say behavior, changing behaviors, because you can have all the plans and you can have all the onboarding lessons, but at the end of the day, is the colleagues' behavior that will affect the inclusion. So to me, it's pivotal that leaders and managers work and monitor the employees' behavior. I think the approach must be more personal, and if someone is behaving in an appropriate way that goes against the company's policies and philosophy, I think you should be able to call up on that to that person and have a talk. Thank you.
All right, anyone else? Okay, thank you. Yes, and I think in that inclusive leadership, also in fact inclusive employeeship. To what extent do we all speak up or react when we hear that jargon, or when we see things that we just don't think is okay? And another risk factor for non-inclusive work environments is where we have disparity in power or imbalance in power, and where we maybe have high-value employees or leaders who have power and are therefore excused with the wrong behavior. So it could be a salesperson who delivers excellent numbers. That person is crucial to the organization's success. Realizes so, maybe or maybe not, subconsciously or consciously, and is actually able to be less than inclusive in his or her behavior. I'd like to give 4 examples of concrete things that I've seen and that I see that are more towards the right-hand side of the scale. What I shared were more focus areas rather than maybe activities. So how can it actually be put in practice? So on the topic of inclusive leadership and a shared sense of purpose and this kind of inclusive employeeship as well. Qantas, the Australian airline company, released its numbers last year. And they had been able to turn around the business from doing quite poorly to doing really, really well. And what was interesting was that the CEO, when he talked about the numbers, he talked, of course, about the innovation and the productivity gains they had done, but he attributed it highly to the fact that they had a culture of diversity and more so a culture of inclusion. He talked about how their employees were able to deliver even greater results because they had a very high level of engagement thanks to an active, inclusive culture. And for a leader to really be so specific when sharing the results of his business, attributing the fact that they were successful to those factors, I think is a testament of an inclusive leader. But how do you get there, right? It takes scrutinizing yourself. And I think that's mainly where we have a long way to go. Another example I want to mention is reverse mentoring versus traditional mentoring. We have a lot of mentorship programs out there, and I love them. But we have a lot of mentorship programs out there aimed at women. Mentorship programs to support women to grow in the organization, to learn how to maneuver, to get sponsors that can see what a great employee and what great results they're delivering, to learn how to function in the structure that is the company. We do see also reverse mentoring in some places. An example is from another big IT company where a senior VP talked about the insights he had got from a young black woman who was his mentor. I love it. However, it also, of course, falls back to our leaders wanting to listen and to take on the feedback that they get. But it can be really an eye-opener. And I firmly believe we need more of those programs versus mentoring women in organizations. A third example is questioning the status quo to transform the structure of a company. A forestry company in the north of Sweden, the CEO there realized, and he was a big proponent for gender equality, also in a male-dominated industry, realized they only had men working on the assembly line. Why? Because it was very physically demanding, and so it was really just a matter of physical strength that meant that men worked there. And he wanted to change this. They brought in designers to put machines in place so that also women could get on the assembly line, and they did. So not only did he achieve a better gender balance, he also created a better workplace environment for the men, with less risk of injury and förslitningsskador. A fourth example, and the last one I'll share, is digital solutions for systems change. So again, with these courses and a talk like this, maybe, you get a few new ideas, maybe you get new perspectives, and they're great. But how do we make it systematic in our everyday lives? Go Equal is a tool that I work with that really encourages and creates the platform for employees and leaders to start thinking about their behavior, about their values, about what norms are existing here today in our company, and what steps do we need to take to change it. So that's another method to use, and the main industry organization for the farmers in Sweden are using this tool and has also seen a change in that it becomes more everyday systemic change versus that one-time course or lecture. Oftentimes at a talk like this, you would get the top 5 things to do, or top 10 things to take away with you, or top 5 things to share. But I want to share top 5 things not to do with you. It really depends where any given company needs to start their work, where their company needs to start on creating more inclusive workplaces, because everyone is different. And a strategy around diversity and inclusion should always be tied to a company's overall business strategy. So I want to give you a few things that you really shouldn't be doing, because those we can agree on goes for everyone. The first is, don't think you don't need to change. And I will read this for the stream. Everyone thinks of changing the world, but no one thinks of changing himself or herself. This goes back to the fact that this is not a tick in a box activity that we should be doing. It's not enough putting a diversity plan in place. It's not enough having a women's network or another network for underrepresented groups. It's about scrutinizing ourselves and our own behavior, and particularly so for leaders. It's about working on this all the time. And maybe when you think you're done, you're going to need to address another issue. I've talked mainly about gender here today, but we have other areas and other groups that are underrepresented in tech? How do we make sure they're included? And we know that women of color, maybe with disabilities of certain ages, are even more disadvantaged. So the work should never stop. And we all need to change. Number 2, don't hire you. Why do we see such homogeneous leadership groups and board groups? Why do many organization announcements show the same 9 or 10 white middle-aged men? Because we like to work with people that are like us. It's human nature. I click with someone, normally they're somewhat similar to me, and it's easier to work with them. Diversity is difficult, because I have to go beyond my comfort zone and try to understand and work with people that are different from me. Now, this doesn't go if you're a woman hiring other women into tech. That's the only exception to this rule. Number 3, stop fixing the women. Let's stop all initiatives today in addressing women and how women need to adjust to the structures we have in place. Let's not teach women anymore about how to behave or how to lean in, although there are good points in that book. Let's instead focus on the structures that we have in place and how the majority interacts with one another. That's where we can make a change. Let's not think about how women can fit into our structures. Let's think about how the structure can fit women. Number 4, don't rely on one, but on many. In many companies, we see diversity and inclusion managers. I also love them. They're highly skilled and competent and have great knowledge about these topics. But the problem oftentimes is that diversity and inclusion is put on the side as a separate initiative. And you have maybe networks, you have courses, lectures, etc. Far too seldom do we see those initiatives being integrated into the main business. How can we create more ambassadors for these topics in the organizations? How can we create leaders and managers pushing for these topics every day? How can we make sure that this is an area that's considered just as important as any other business area? One example is of an energy company in Sweden where they actually have the leadership team taking turns owning diversity and inclusion for a year at a time. That's interesting. Number 5, and the last one, don't for today, is don't forget to measure. If we think of diversity and inclusion as any other business area, which we should also set targets, but we should start with an analysis of where we are today. We should set targets based on where we want to go. We should set targets based on that are relevant for our business, and we should monitor progress. We should hold managers and leaders accountable for those targets, just as we do with other figures in our operations. All right, so I started today talking about metoo and teknisktfel. I have made the connection that I think is a strong connection between metoo and what it tells us about society and our workplaces, and why we still see such a gender gap in IT and tech. I've talked about what I think is necessary to change things. And if we don't change things, we will continue to see that downward trend. I would love to hear your thoughts, opinions, and if I'm wrong, let me know. Connect with me, reach out and give me your input. And I'd also love to hear good examples of where you see this working, and perhaps even where that gender gap is closing. Thank you.